And I wanted to begin with a quote from Gertrude Stein that I think is really helpful for thinking through some of the issues that we might be wanting to talk about with our poets this evening. She writes, "Beginning again and again is a natural thing, even when there is a series. Beginning again and again and again, explaining composition and time is a natural thing. It is understood by this time that everything is the same except composition and time, composition and the time of composition and the time in composition. Everything is the same except composition, and as the composition is different and always going to be different, everything is not the same. Everything is not the same as the time when of the composition, and the time in the composition is different. The composition is different. That is certain." So in this series, we'll be hearing from poets engaging with what it means to represent the contemporary moment in their poetics, reading and explaining, reflecting on composition at this time, what it means to write through this, this time in which everything is not the same, this time in which there are pressures on poetic language and form. And we're going to hear from two poets this evening, Ariana Benson and Milne. And I'm going to start by introducing Ariana, who I think you're unmuted, aren't you, Ariana? You're there, fantastic. Just let some more people in, waiting room. Ariana Benson is a poet storyteller from Cheapspeake, Virginia. She's currently studying poetic practice at Royal Holloway, University of London, as a Marshall Scholar. Her work has been published in Aunt Chloe and Auburn Avenue, while she also serves as non-fiction editor and is forthcoming in Lunch Ticket. She was the recipient of the 2019 Academy of American Poets Edith A. Hamby Prize. Her poetry and stories integrate psychological theory, poetic practice, and storytelling traditions to interrogate methods by which modern Black narratives preserve collective memory of descendants of the African diaspora. I'm really excited to welcome Ariana to take part in this series. It seems to me that her work enacts a real tenacity in relation to language. I am really excited about the way in which she explores the historical and the contextual refiguring that brings the present sharply and starkly into focus, how she explores the most apparently everyday objects in relation to their invisible histories and brings us slap bang into the contemporary moment. Thank you, Ariana.
Thank you, Del. That was such a wonderful, such a generous introduction. And of course, I have to thank both you and Will and the Royal Holloway Poetics Research Center for having me, and of course, Drew for reading alongside me, and everyone who is here to watch us read. So thank you all. Okay, so I'm going to break traditional reading convention just a little bit and explain this first poem called "There Is No Such Thing as Real Pineapple." So in colonial America and the United Kingdom, the pineapple was served as a symbol of hospitality and wealth. But in places like Ghana and Hawaii and Brazil, where pineapple is mass produced and mass marketed, the fruit is more associated with harsh labor conditions and agricultural exploitation, and just kind of a symbol of how culture has shifted from these indigenous places to a broader and westernized idea of symbol. Right. And so this poem comes from kind of that knowledge and those histories, and also is a series of definitions. So if you're hearing it and you're listening to me, I hope that you are seeing the image of words in a dictionary. So they'll have like the adjective description, they'll have the history of the word, and hopefully that kind of helps you read the poem alongside me as I'm reading it aloud. There is no such thing as real pineapple. Pineapple, noun, English, a tropical monocotyledonous plant, an anastomosis of the family Bromeliaceae, the pineapple family, that has rigid, spiny-margined, recurved leaves and a short stalk with a dense, oblong head of small, abortive flowers. Example, pineapples do not grow naturally in Europe due to lack of warmth in the soil. Pine, noun, English, spiny cone plant. Pine, verb, English, long-standing, seemingly perennial desire for something just out of one's reach. Pineapple, verb, English, to perpetually want. Apple, noun, English, the fleshy, typically red, yellow, or green edible pome fruit of a usually cultivated tree of the rose family. Apple, noun, English, placeholder for any yet undiscovered fruit. Discover, verb, English, to make real. Example, Christopher Columbus discovered pineapple fruit during his exploration of the then uncharted territory of the Americas. Real, adjective, English, that which we know and can call by name. Synonyms of real, apple, pine. See also, English. Fruit, noun, English, all products of the soil. Soil, noun, English, tangible manifestation of land. Land, noun, English, earth over which living beings claim territory. Territory, noun, English, a term used to make land belong. Uncharted, as in territory, adjective, English, not yet belonging to any living being, occupied only by fruit and seeds. Fruit, noun, plant with meaty flesh enveloping entrenched stone or seed. Seed, noun, something fruit leaves behind, as in remnants to be trodden or buried in dirt, interred alive as much as something so small can be considered alive. Example, seeds have been bred out of pineapples, as they make the flesh of the fruit more difficult to consume. Seed, adjective, invisible until it produces something great, excellent, nana, fruitful. Synonyms of seed, brown, black. Nana or ananas, noun, from Tupi Guarani nana, excellent fruit. Example, the indigenous Tupi Guarani people ate nana, the fruit fed to mothers by their mothers, sweet juice dribbled down shared skin, fruit of kin. Indigenous, adjective, see also, fruit, seed. Fruit, noun, English, the profitable commodity sprung from typically black or brown seeds. Seed, noun, a live sacrifice of oneself for one's children and descendants. Synonyms of seed, martyr, indigenous, ancestor, prelude to fruit. Fruit, adjective, ripe, primed for consumption by living beings. Synonyms of fruit, ananas, Tupi Guarani. English, noun, living beings. Ananas, noun, English, there is nothing matching the word you have entered. Nothing, noun, English, the absence of something of substance, a being that does not exist. Exist, verb, English, to be real, to have been seen provably by a living being. Real, noun, English, that which living beings know and call by name. Synonyms of real, pine, apple, pineapple, soil, land, territory. Antonyms of real, uncharted, seed, fruit. Fruit, noun, English, the tangible harvest of labor. Synonyms of fruit, ananas, indigenous, Tupi Guarani, brown, black. Thank you, so that's the first one. Now we're going to go to my second poem, which is formally a little bit of a change, but still rooted in this kind of practice I have of finding objects or seeing things and then looking into their histories and thinking about what kind of poems I can make from that history. So this poem was inspired by actually a trip that I took with Dell and my lovely classmates to the South Bank Center, the Bridget Reagan Gallery, I believe it is. And the exhibition that was going on was about trees, all different kinds of trees, forests, things like that. And there was one kind of tree that stood out to me in particular as being really interesting and symbolic. And so that is the tree that this poem is about. Triptych, in which I show you my ancestral family trees. On the immortal underground forest, pyrogenic geoxylic suffratex. These woody plants can be compared to underground trees. A whole area may be one plant, and it's the canopy that just sticks out, the tips of the branches above the ground. These tips may burn down every year, but the rest of the tree stays untouched underground. They are essentially immortal, nothing can kill them. And that's from Professor Bram van Wyk, plant taxonomist from the University of Pretoria. Pyrogenic, the immortal born of heat despite the flames. Let me show you that a harvest in due time sprouted here. You see that the darkest colors say the things we cannot. So how can generations exist to mass murder? Cruel men will make meals of massacre because greed will devour anything. All that breathes will be consumed. But our trees have flourished. Buried deep, they drink the tears themselves when nothing else is left. They offer raw flesh stemmed from rare wounds that went without air to endure the fires. Geoxylic, underground and exiled land, its invisible existence buds within blooms that will produce rich nectar from this scorched earth. Its leaves are mostly shades men see absent light. I show you this because raw produce never truly feeds the hungriest seedlings, even the ones insulated by white light, and especially us, the black saplings. To beasts, we are merely crops, watering sparingly and grown in arid soil. We cry, forced to sacrifice still red skin to keep the future breathing so our seeds might survive to withstand the drought. Suffratex, a forest that knows that in between suffer and root there is fledgling fruit, itself a kind of sweetness that nurtured me into being. A rainbow of black and brown they cannot burn. We know these things are true. That entire bodies are simpler than bullets. That the appetite of predators, without shame, without roots, is insatiable. That all beings with rotted teeth, with only blood diamonds to fertilize their limbs, they are the ones that choke the masses. This is what they do to ensure generations will thrive. Pyrogenic, geoxylic, suffratex. The immortal underground, a forest born of heat, an exiled land that knows, despite its invisible existence, that in between the flames buds, suffer, and root. Let me show you that within blooms there is fledgling fruit, a harvest that will produce itself in due time. Rich nectar, a kind of sweetness sprouted here from this scorched earth that nurtured me into being. You see that its leaves are a rainbow of the darkest colors, mostly shades of black and brown. They say men cannot burn the things we cannot see, absent light. We know these things are true. So how can I show you this? That entire generations exist because raw bodies are simpler to mass produce than bullets. That murder never truly feeds the appetite of cruel men. The hungriest predators will make meals of seedlings without shame, massacre even the ones without roots. Because greed, insulated by white light, is insatiable, will devour anything, and that all beings, all that breathes, especially us, the black saplings, will be consumed with rotted teeth. To beasts, we are merely crops. But our trees, watered sparingly with blood, have flourished and grown diamonds buried deep in arid soil. They drink the tears we cry to fertilize themselves, forced to sacrifice their limbs when nothing else is left. They offer raw flesh, the one stemmed from rare wounds that went without air, to keep the future breathing, that choke so our seeds might survive the masses. This is what they do, to endure the fires, to withstand the drought, to ensure generations will thrive. Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you, Ariana. It's really moving, extraordinary performance. I hope it's okay if I go into some questions to speak about the work now, maybe, and other people will have a chance to maybe ask some questions later. The poems that you presented are quite different in terms of this approach to the everyday, this approach to the temporal, the now. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your approach, whether you're working with historical materials or whether you're responding to the contemporary, and how that works in your practice as you go about writing the everyday.
So I think it's both, right? Most of the poems that I write and create come from things that I come across in my everyday life. I'm thinking about pineapple that might have been sitting on the kitchen table, or a pineapple that I incurred on my trip to Ghana, or I'm thinking about trees like in a museum exhibit. And then I usually go back and research the histories of these everyday objects, because I'm really interested in kind of the quotidian, to steal a word from my best friend, the quotidian, but also how these histories of the quotidian have informed how we see these things today. And so that's kind of what I'm doing, especially with triptych, because these plants have been around for thousands of years. They are literally living relics interred in the ground. And also I think that informs kind of the way in which especially people of the African diaspora have endured, hardships, have survived, and have really adapted to certain situations. And so I think a lot of my work is drawing parallels between the natural world and the man-made world, and how we adapt kind of in the way of nature.
Thank you. Fantastic answer. So in Pineapple, the poem in Pineapple, you use the dictionary definitions. It seems like you're unpicking and, in a sense, reinventing that word pineapple, as well as its history as a commodity and symbol of colonialism, as you said at the beginning. Do you want to talk further about the importance of engaging with the dictionary in your work? I know it's important in terms of notions of definition and redefining, but what conceptual or political or poetic functions does it serve? Why is it such an important methodology for you in your practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I feel like words really are the building blocks of everything, but especially poetics, right? In terms of how we communicate and how we inform like discussions about poetry, about art, about the ways in which we interrogate these things in the world. And so definitions are so important, because that defines how we use the word, that defines what context we use it in, and the things that it symbolizes. And so it's really important to then discover, well, who gets to make these definitions, and who gets to decide what these words mean. And so with the pineapple poem specifically, the word pineapple obviously has English roots, but it's actually derived from, or it was taken from, the word nana, which is the Tupi-Guarani, like original word for pineapple, and just how these things have shifted. And so what does it look like when the definition, or even the roots of the word itself, has shifted and adapted to a different culture? And how has that acted in parallel with things like colonialism, like imperialism, and how has that kind of shifted even the way we look at certain indigenous or Black and brown cultures? And so words are really at the root of this. And I feel like if we can unpack the definitions, and we can unpack where the words come from, then we can really kind of recontextualize even the most common things as we know them.
Thank you. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the importance of the tree. And obviously the baobab tree is so important in your triptych poem. And it's also obviously a political symbol, isn't it? Really important one. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that, perhaps in terms of the decisions you made then about the structure of the poem, and perhaps you could explain for people that obviously can't see the poem and haven't seen the poem yet because it's not yet published, but it has a really interesting structure in terms of, which seems to relate to the tree and unfolding. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you could hear it when I was reading, but there are some phrases that, of course, I repeated in the last reading of the poem. So the poem is a contrapuntal triptych, as in there are 3 columns, and those individually, in my mind, kind of make up miniature poems discussing like what I'm discussing as far as the resilience of the tree. And then those are read vertically. And then in my last kind of pass over the poem, I read it horizontally. And so all the pieces kind of flow together, and they tell the grander narrative of the underground baobab trees, and of the resilience of, the family trees of somebody who is a descendant of the African diaspora. And I did the structure like that, I think, because I'm thinking of it as, of course, trees. So you go to branches. And so the 3 are kind of branches of this larger narrative or story that I'm trying to craft. And then as far as the symbolism of the baobab tree, of course, it's indigenous to sub-Saharan Africa. It is very symbolic of their cultures, and specifically how they have a relationship that is really, really rooted in the earth and is really rooted in nature. And so I'm thinking of that as far as how can we explore the branches of this tree and how the descendants of the diaspora are still rooted in these natural things, but have also had to be very resilient and very adaptive, as has the tree. And so that was kind of.
Yeah, thank you. So, because I was really struck by the way in which there were recursive patterns that were coming back. So the way in which it both works on the page visually in terms of its columns, but then there's a sonic pattern as you return to you read all the way down, don't you, in terms of columns, and then you come back across those almost like a grid. And the difference between when you read down, one of the lines goes, that entire, we know these things are true, that entire bodies are simpler than bullets. And yet when you come to it across, you come to the same lines. So how can I show you this, that entire generations exist because raw bodies are simpler to mass produce than bullets? And I'm really interested in the way that in the construction of that as a form, that you seem to be working in a really interesting way, that successive readings in performance start to bring out other contexts, start to return to the same language as a kind of object, but inflect it with different histories, different contexts. And that seems to be a real strength of the reading. Is that something then that you're thinking about as a relationship between what you're doing in performance and then what's on the page as well?
Yeah, certainly. So I do want this poem to kind of, I guess, and to keep using tree metaphors, but like branch out after the reading, and so that you're thinking about the different contexts in which these things are really relevant. And so just to kind of like return specifically to that line, when I'm thinking of entire bodies are simpler than bullets, obviously that's a more modern reference to maybe things that we're dealing with today in terms of like guns and violence and things like that. And then to go back to I show you that entire generations exist because raw bodies are simpler to mass produce than bullets. That is more of the historical undertone coming in of how these people got to be where we are, how, you know, why our culture is this way, how things are grounded in this really kind of origin of violence, but also how we've adapted to grow and to nurture beautiful things out of that violence. And so, yeah, I really think I'm working with a kind of parallel, and I'm hoping that I'm encouraging audiences to think of my work both in contemporary and historical contexts.
Thank you. And I suppose just one last question before we move on, but I was very struck in both the poems between the violence that's there between the plant bodies and the human bodies, that they're being juxtaposed, they're being interwoven and figured together and then separately. And it's very striking in terms of the poems, the violence towards the plants, the trees, the fruits, but also the indestructibility of these trees. And I wondered if it almost this violent eco-poetics was something that was driving the way in which you were approaching how to write about fruit, trees, the natural world, in a way that sets your work as something quite distinct in its approach than a sort of, than I suppose a romanticism, a different type of romanticism in relation to the natural world. And I wondered if that was sort of something that you were interested in pushing further and pushing those boundaries.
Yeah, definitely. I think you've said it really well, that a lot of nature writing is very romantic and is really thinking about the beauty of the natural world, and not that that's entirely removed from my work, I would hope. But I do want to kind of push that label and think about how our human relationships with the natural world and how we produce plants and how we, you know, often have destroyed them, things like forest fires, is really inherently violent. And then to then draw a parallel from how we interact with the natural world to how we interact with each other, I thought might be a really interesting way to come at this, because for me, I'm all about trying to find the symbolism or the stories in the mundane and the simple, and what is more common than nature. We've all, you know, interacted with nature in some way in our lives. And so I think that this is kind of a vehicle for me to tell the stories that I want to tell, to talk about the histories that I want to talk about in a way that also is very broad and very expansive of the human condition as we interact with the earth.
Fantastic. Lovely. Thank you. Great. So I'm going to now hand over to Will, but I'm really excited to be able to introduce Drew Milne and reader I Married Him.
Welcome, Drew. It's really good to have you here. Drew, as some of you will know, was gave a couple of readings for us as part of our Polyply series a few years ago. Drew first came across my radar as a kind of scourge of post-structuralism in 80s Cambridge. And he then came across my poetry radar as co-editor and editor of the journal Parataxis, which was really important at propagating the kind of transatlantic dialogue that's become so important to our world. I think Parataxis was a great place for serious critical commentary on contemporary poetry in a way that it's quite hard to find in those days. And when I think of Drew's poetry, I think of a lyric that's broad enough to encompass popular song. And I think of a wit that's broad enough to embrace conceptual hijinks and low puns. I also think of politics that's pushing Marxism into contact with a form of radical eco-poetics. And Drew is in Cambridge, but in, I think, important ways, he's not of Cambridge. His collected poems In Darkest Capital was published by Carcanet in 2017. Recent chapbooks include Earthworks, that's Equipage, Lichens in Antarctica, and more of lichens later, I think, and Cutting Carbons 2019. And these are both published by the cultural organization, the Institute of Electric Crinolines. His book of mini novellas entitled Third Nature is forthcoming from Dostoevsky Wannabe. And among recent essays, Notes on Lichen appeared in Textual Practice in 2019. He's Judith E. Wilson Reader in Poetics and a Fellow of Corpus Christi College at the University of Cambridge. Welcome, Drew.
Thanks, Will. I'm not sure I can live up to that introduction, but thank you. It's a really great pleasure to be seeing so many people that I know and cherish, and it's sort of a reminder of how difficult it is to be in the world. So it's really a thrill to be here with you like this. Unfortunately, there are some dark sides to the thrill as well, and some of my poems reflect that. So I'm sorry if they're not all kind of jumping with joy. But what I want to do is to talk a little bit about writing through this and work that I've been doing. One of the things that's been happening under the situation we're in, which I think has the sort of twin pressure of the pandemic and the realization that it's a racist world that's making that pandemic particularly violent in certain parts of the world in ways that are really significant, but perhaps have the potential for radical change. But under the pressure of that, I've been looking at work that hasn't been published and thinking whether it stands up to these new pressures. And I've written some new poems that have been written in the last, finished, if you like, yesterday, written in the last week, that are very contemporary with this moment. But I've got a few poems I want to read just to kind of talk myself into the contemporary that somehow resonate a little bit differently in relation to where we are now because of where we are now, but might speak to the present nevertheless. The idea that poetry stays news is reassuring, but it's more reassuring if you've published poems, whereas if you have unpublished poems gathering a certain kind of historical weight that they hadn't imagined, you have to look at them in a new light. So I'm going to read a couple of poems from a large sequence that is finished, I hope, in honor of Frank O'Hara, which rewrite Frank O'Hara's poems and transpose them into the present. This one is called Housebound in Artex. We avoid the walls. And yes, we are sidestepping plaster, crumbling out into the lungs of the staircase and ceilings, in decorators' hands so costly, and our throats all dry. Haven't you ever taken a turn for the worse? And didn't your friends dissolve into their lives? Isn't that what family life entails? The lost sleep of keeping the show on a kind of transport before you nod off? It's not an option to jump ship or fly. And the garden fence is shot to pieces like the bathroom tiles of black and white, of bodged plumbing and broken dimmers. Tender more sympathy than the finger over the skirting board in the hour of inspection, green cleaning, before the night skips in from freight trains and out there everything is drunk and noisy. This is called Two Transpositions from another Frank O'Hara homage. Has an epigraph. I won't explain it. Eventually the sun will die in the flare that nevertheless passes for sunny fires. Ancient lumens strikes no one as news, and yet the fragility of passing sadness becomes intimate with living this life. 1. Well, we're not going to face music because we're all arms and legs, half asleep in the crash position. That is the default for prayers anyway, hunters and gatherers in the wreckage. And we guess that gleaning the dead isn't going to be a lasting solution. 2. I'm overjoyed that sunshine is real and that it is all right to bathe again, like a lobster freed from bouillabaisse. Let's live love letters on ancient steeds, pots of basil, laurel tea, and mild mead. We take everything in moderation, but pass out on the prospect of global fires and drink too much in the darker days. And then nothing tastes quite so earthly, just some part of the familiar chip and pin and the Herculean labor of passwords. But the light on my phone's beyond me. And the last of these little O'Hara homages this is a poem based on O'Hara's poem Mayakovsky. And partly why I thought it was worth risking reading this is because of the pressure on this poem of the expression "I can't breathe" in relation to my experience of breathing and being in a hospital struggling with breathing and thinking about people in hospitals trying to cope with damaged lungs and damaged breathing systems. O'Hara. 1. My tonsils are gone. I'm fainting in the bathroom crying, fuck, fuck, what's left of me? If you can just cope with the debris and blindside the staples, my weeping broken neck, my taste buds done to dirt, then I can put on a dry face, I wish, and carry my nose feed. 2. I love you, but I'm running out of breath and my blood count is weak. Like a soil, solids. Don't be puke as I am puke, seaweed, thin green gruel, a bowl, and I'll breathe through windows of blitzed muzak, which at worst are dancers gone wildfire. Cannot sing, cannot air or smile, what a corpse. And the queue for the toilet stretches beyond my baggage. I embraced chemistry, but when I pissed, it was clear. 3. That's it. There's blood on the plastic striking right out of my mouth and yet still running through my nose. So I'll wait on water for the weekend as I'm trundled out along corridors. The walls are curtains that cannot sing, but relay sounds and sundry evacuations. I dwell on the persistence of lichens. 4. Now I'm mutely persisting for the implosion of my delusions to seem more like a glossy mag, something to share and be spent. The room is washed out and pale and turned out for infections, alarms and ceilings of pain, generally surviving. The plastics, not just easy, not just washed out. It may be the darkest day of my year. What does anyone think of that? I mean, who cares, as I do? Perhaps I'm still fighting for breath. And in a rather different mood and mode, the following poems are from a sequence called Lyric Fire. And they're a bit shoutier. At least this one is. Hey there, corporate carbon. Hey there, corporate carbon. Is that a death drive in your portfolio? Or are you just thrilled to kill me and everything else that walks the earth? You and the most incendiary phrases clouding the sky, if it is still sky or gloom. But how many corpses is it will break to let slip, find the science, but play clowns who can't count billions? Oh, and we don't return your contempt with the spades it deserves, because we can only take our stand in a shared song. The cardioid pattern is still set for song, up in big tech shrinking inside violence before signal clips, face crush sibilance, and everything still sounds natural as sputtered gold into visceral abstraction, a gentle presence peak with an open and airy quality popping to what satin. But the talk is how to simplify radicals rather than looking for perfect squares, and some way not shown in logbooks like cheat Mila Felcher with the accents. Then again, choose life, and here is how. Find the prime account inside capital, then divide by the number of people on the outside by the owning prime so as to determine the indices of class, race, and gender, not forgetting fires. Simplify the expressions on either side of the equation, then multiply all variables till radicals are history. Now, doesn't that feel like something? The transparencies. No, they don't want a string section so clear the power can leak as news. The overlapping page as if to shout stop in the name of the some people. How the separated child cries, no, no, nor ever now for a murdered species seared into strain and coal, and what barrels gluing slavery sown through gammon-made memes, driven home through petrol to start up so deadly, ribbons with carbon flour, gorging, nothing much resembles human life. Well, stick around to applaud matter, nothing much being plastic residues, now linescapes, and in barking songs, boozy Zeus ate trees for breakfast by the retreating glacier, revealing the stuff of the known in a freezer so crude was apt and mirage fighter on a lawn painting camouflage tanks, keeping the taboo of cast cream, mind going global on to Damascus, signets as even a sapphire blemish, the move and the shift, oh horizon, goes dark marking feet, as if its concept is writing back a once sunny vector, and why not, if you so stir, universal sheet, or just extinction by numbers, off the hark and dusty barrow stone. Come, come, you're at sea on the tide of human stamps and silent canaries, all mechanic slaves stoking romance. And the last little batch of poems I'm going to read are the ones that I've written in the last few weeks under lockdown, whatever we call it. They have the group title Sick Rose, which riffs on Blake's poem, A Sick Rose. There's not much Blake in my version, but it plays with some of the Blake. Six fairly short poems, and I think I'm not going to explain them, I'm just going to read them. Song of the Virus. Cull the dark biome, its conjunctions trashing, discretion and distance, down aerosol solidarity, no names, no genealogy, only a name police chorus. We are beside ourselves, not merely green screen, in the forcing of night workers amid the guilts and the furloughed, where the author's mere grammar returns for sediments and growth. How, under the sign of capital gone fishing, the breathers are as toxins. Eat or be eaten is the principle of pasta, bog roll, and hand gel, spent on something, not as if the air has no history, but here in the submarine of ideology, zones of inhibition talk of dusters, colonized mats. Yet again, nature is more radical, and radiant mutinies just in time for subsidence into spreadsheets, now plotting resistances of form. What form, comrade? What humbler crevice to be done with shows and makeshift crofts? empire of the niche. How sampling persists on agar plates, how in colonies of subculture viewed as by monsters, amplified screening engages the witch, the who, the primers, all in pea green gel to sequence, dance by the light of grief, just as in mosses no special viruses have been found. The same cannot be said of the herded in speculative lungs, out of tobacco mosaic or green mottle, and some dead of models making all the necessary redactions of open blue as far as the eye can see in ribbons and reading frames that evidently indicate artifacts, infected stabs more frequent than thought, gone on mutating form, but in whose classification are we not truly living, the want of cell structures only to be known by the rolling leaves, the yellows, the vein-clearing strands. Remote living. Is there an archive still for some virus of the deadly note in analog shifts, not for the many, more stable phages made to semble lichens, though recent work on toxins lacks the charm of the original, and not for nothing, living worlds spill into domains, but without felt consensus, just pitfalls and makeshifts. So the universal tree of exclusion speaks to a home secretary on fire, set on tracing back the fantasy of origins as if etymology were a god, nor even the stuff of torn plasmids, open to ribbons and on the make. Now everything is remote, for the mask of shoppers gone raw in tooth and glove, and prejudice spit, so carried away in flames it inscribes itself among dancers. Lego in Arcadia. Hot tubs of the rich and famous, we're all in this together, like reason's soup. But there's no special provenance in the fall of particulate drops, and shelter coming to definitions, too remote off corona maths. Sing endless shedding of light as grammar's inertia to flatten the curve of life into earth and plastic. Now, autonomy of the mammal falls for a fragile truce with living, to predict the sheepish chronicle and swoon of metrics, that's good, and it's until it seems less reasonable sung of owners of flocks, not hirelings. Then shed light and more scope opens the canto-marked bootlegs. Oh, but the examples still came as a bombshell to burning mutual charms on fields of carbon sky. Periscopes among the elected. Evenings in with ideology, by the look of dark stains, as today's taxonomy book offers electron micrographs, and in the event of the open view, may not be able to identify a virus beyond the means of commercial test kits, missing, much like nests, among the minuted parts and squalls, trigger hairs for class warfare as great and gorgeous as dolphins. It may safely be affirmed that wild prospects await Occidental fabulists set on embracing the brazen tube to rule this ebony shed, sable fur, obtuse as cats endowed with some property of felting that, before song can bud out through the membrane, cytoplasm naked, or out into extracellular space. That shed light on assimilation, conjugated with colloidal bleach. Cytokine storm. Lichens against primeval forest, disturbed by humans and bloggers. How diversity keels over and nature so sadly dying tends the reserve virus, wars of white sustenance. Well, the march to burning carbon cuddles ecology for equity, forced to bow out of local circumstance and labor, draft management composing itself as species, dropping name teak and ash, wood sugar, fodder, pulp. Off sail go the guinea men, as dead to reason talks up naught so much as a Bible or a mask of plague, habits by burning rocks, how often use falls to justify state trolls. And that's where you come in now, working from the homespun office. invisible worm signing dust bowl depressions, downwind the new blitz. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Drew, for that, for sharing such recent work, and it was a really tremendous reading. Thank you very much. I've got a few questions. And the first thing that came to mind was just if you could say a few words about the title. Okay, so the rose obviously has a long history in poetry, and in 20th century poetry, you've got Stein's "Rose is a Rose" and H.D.'s "Hard Rose," and Williams talking about an obsolete rose. Why title a poem? Why bring a rose? Why bring the echo of Blake now?
It's partly that these poems are envisaged as a film, and the material I could use to make the film is largely what's in the back garden. So I've been filming the back garden, and there were some roses, and the one that, if I can duck, you can see. That's the film, is of that rose. Yeah. And it's a peculiar color. And I was interested in the viruses that were living in the rose and the extent to which we are unaware of the viruses around us and the invisibility of that. Partly because promoted by the fact that I've done some work on viruses that live in the environments and habitats afforded them by lichens, so that the extent to which the virus has been part of my kind of imagination of lichens for a while meant that the idea of a virus world that we coexist with but scarcely recognize seemed particularly interesting. Blake's poems, terrific, all kinds of things about it interesting. And then the idea that the rose is in some way allegorically, inevitably English, and that it was sick just seems so powerful and obvious. Such a messy, disastrous period of mismanagement by the government in relation to a kind of pandemic of government sickness on top of everything else. It just seemed to capture it all rather neatly.
Thank you. Thank you. This is really embarrassing. I'm going to have to let the dog out because it's scratching away. It's going to start barking at any moment. Hang on.
It's good to know that life's still carrying on.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, yeah, I'm very interested in the idea of virus as metaphor, and the virus is somehow something that's alive but not alive. I was curious about the way that you talked about the agar plates, you talked about bacteria. There's a way in which, when you use the word culture, it cuts across both the social and the bacterial. There's a lot of biological language in the poem that was unfamiliar to me: cytokine, cytoplasm, plasmids, and then there's also a lot of language that was just felt like you were sort of channeling the language we're all hearing every day. There's the language of tracing, we're all in this together. There's the herd. So I suppose the question is, could you say a little bit about this interface between the social and the bacterial stroke viral in the text?
I suppose that the thing that matters for me is the way in which we're dependent in all kinds of important ways on science. So when the message comes through that we are kind of following the science, I think it's pretty obvious that we need to try and keep up with the science for various political and social reasons. And if you investigate the science of viruses, you get into some quite complicated and difficult territories quite quickly. So I've been into some of those territories. I got into this partly through a process of reading up on my own illnesses and viruses associated with things that I've suffered from. So I've been interested in viruses for a while. But to the extent that the relationship between viruses and science takes you into a world of complex skepticism, scientists are not usually that confident about what they've got to say, rightly so. So that when you start to investigate their vocabulary and their rhetoric, you end up with a peculiar kind of world in which scientists talk about lichens, for example, as forms of life that colonize. And they use this word colonize all the time. And it's extraordinary I mean, I've asked scientists about this, earth scientists, plant scientists, why do they talk about plants colonizing? It seems such an obviously mistaken political metaphor. And they talk about shedding light, a kind of, people say this sheds light on X. And the idea of light being shed to me seems, I kind of partly I picture kind of garden sheds, but also in relation to the idea of viral shedding and viral overloads. The metaphors are so powerful, and yet they seem so dead and inert in the way in which the scientists use them. And yet we're dependent on these people. So the kind of complexity of the way in which the language of science doesn't quite interact with the reality of language becomes, for me, very critical for where a poem might be. Cytokine storm, for example, is the peculiar phrase used to describe a kind of immune overload that produces certain post-viral kind of traumatic things that seem to be significant for the people who suffer really badly from COVID-19. And not just for COVID-19, it's a post-viral problem for other kinds of viral conditions. But the fact that it's called cytokine storm and almost nobody knows even how to pronounce it seems to me quite significant. So trying to investigate the rhetoric of that is partly what I've been obliged to do, not necessarily with any sense that it's communicative, but that the language forces me to go there.
Thanks very much. Thank you. My last question, I think it sort of picks up on some of what you've been talking about. I wanted to ask you about lichen. When you turned up on Facebook a few years ago, I thought it was a joke about liking, and maybe that is sort of folded in there somewhere. But I'm curious about how long you stuck with lichen. It's a hybrid entity. It mixes fungi and algae. I'm curious about, where is the sort of, where do you locate the immense figurative energy of lichen in your work? And in particular, there's a quality of very, what's the word? There's quality of skepticism about your work and disappointment and anger. There's a powerful diagnostic quality to the work, thinking about what's going wrong, the many things that are going wrong in our contemporary crisis or crises. But there's also a moment of, there are moments in what you've just read, Song to Bud Out, the swoon of metrics. There seems to be a kind of hopeful poetics there somewhere, poetics of resistance modelled somehow on lichen. And I'm wondering if you could just explain a little bit about how lichen works for you in your poetics.
There's a little bit of lichen in one of my very first published poems, and they've sort of been lurking there right from the beginning in relation to a kind of conflicted relationship with Scottish nature and a kind of deep irritation with the romantic kind of Highlands and the idea that we should celebrate marching through the tartan heather and all of that kind of stuff. And a sense of the powerful politics of desolation associated with the stripping of the Scottish landscape. In relation to the interests of industrial, agricultural kind of capital. So there's a kind of sense in which the lichens have always been part of the resistance to that in terms of my kind of understanding of the bits of nature that survive whatever awful bits of kind of human stuff have been done to it. But in more recent terms, I think there's something powerful about the idea that lichens are a significant feature of how we will cope with climate change. There's a very large amount of lichens on the planet, and they will survive the human. That, I think, is also a consolation. But they're responsible collectively for all kinds of processes associated with nitrogen fixation and carbon dioxide I think. There's an epigraph in Cutting Carbons which kind of gets to the nub of this, which suggests that lichens are responsible for kind of dealing roughly with the amount of emissions associated with fossil fuels that humans produce on Earth, and that lichens kind of, their collective contribution to human life on Earth is part of that. So that the quantity of political solidarity that lichens express with the possibility of human oxygen life is significant, and we certainly don't return the favor. So there's a kind of starting point about the air we breathe and the extent to which lichens are crucial for oxygen and nitrogen fixation, and yet almost invisible to most processes of life in relation to how significant they are for the politics of climate change. And they're also significant as pollution monitors, that's long been known. And the extent to which they're kind of symbiotic solidarity kind of cultures and formations of certain kinds of unlikely combinations that find ways of hanging on in extreme situations, that just seems to me very suggestive. And the more I worked on lichens, every time I kind of started looking into something, the more incredible they became. So I've continually been rewarded by kind of working on lichens by discovering more things about them that have seemed to me politically generative, and I have wanted to write about them. And I suppose I kind of think that poetry isn't just a human thing, that it's a kind of thing about how language inhabits the earth, and the air we breathe is very much part of the song of lichens on this earth, and I want to kind of express some solidarity with that.
Thanks very much. Thank you. And thanks for reading for us. It's been really good to have you here, wherever here is. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, no, the digital lichen. There was a joke there. I thought when I went on Facebook, I thought it would be nice if people liked lichens, and that there would be a counter meme to the like that would be lichens, and that there wasn't a plan for the digital lichen to take over from cats as a form of expressing enthusiasm on the digital world. So I still hope for digital lichens to have a kind of functional meme structure of changing the way in which we think about the world on the digital. So the digital lichen is still part of my politics.
Great.
It's not the project isn't taking off very, very successfully, I'm afraid to say.
There's time, I hope.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Drew. Thank you for that, Will. Fantastic. Before we make an experiment and open this up to questions from some of you, I just wanted to return to a question to both of you, returning to that phrase that we began with from Gertrude Stein. The phrase where she's moving through composition, and she talks about composition. Everything is the same except composition in time. Composition is different and always going to be different. Everything is not the same. Everything is not the same as the time when of the composition, and the time in the composition is different. And I suppose I just wanted to finish my line of questioning, really, to ask both of you to reflect on that relationship between the specific compositional strategies which you've wanted to engage with, that have seemed necessary and important in this moment, in this contemporary moment of writing, when you write through. If you could just say something to that, would be great. So maybe we could come back to you, Ariana, first, if that's possible.
Yes, so as far as, like, I guess composition of writing in this specific moment, obviously everything is digital, and we're separated from, I guess, the spaces from which at least I know that I draw inspiration most, which is often like going out into the world and seeing things. And so how that has affected like the composition of my poems is that I'm relying a lot less on site-specific writing or site-specific gleanings, and a lot more on memory. And I really think that takes it kind of to a different place as far as my work, because even though my work is a lot of ancestral memory and dealing with things like that, it is very much centered in contemporary things, or like my contemporary thoughts on things. And so to kind of return to memory as an element of composition, I think has been really beautiful and interesting, and it's taken my work in a different direction. Hope that answered.
Fantastic. And Drew, do you have a thought on that?
I do. I'm interested in the word transposition. One of the transpositions from Frank O'Hara was called Two Transpositions, and I suppose I think of poems as transpositions, partly of language and of other forms of kind of aesthetic processing. So that I'm a bit suspicious of. I love Gertrude Stein, but I'm a bit suspicious of her genius tendencies in relation to the power of her as a composer. And I think I'm more. I feel more comfortable with the idea that I'm a transposer, and that rather than it being possible to compose things and put them together like some kind of genius, that you can put things in different places and kind of transpose them musically, and kind of think about transposition as a kind of key process. Lichens don't transpose, and that's part of their charm.
Thank you.